Okay, so for this part, I will talk about my case studies on Cuba. So I'm going to talk about the government structure and economy in Cuba, the U.S. intervention in Cuba, and migration in Cuba. So let's start with the government. Like I said in the last part, this person right here, Raul Castro, is the leader of Cuba, the present leader, not Fidel Castro, who is this guy. Now, Fidel Castro was the previous leader of Cuba from 1959, when he took over Cuba in the revolution, to 2008. So in 2008, Fidel gave his brother Raul the throne to be president. Why? Because of his aging health reasons. Now, Fidel Castro was about 82 years old when he gave up his role as president. So he was getting pretty old. So a new leader had to step up, even though Raul Castro was just as old as Fidel Castro. Cuba is considered to be a communist state during the 20th century, specifically the Cold War, and is still considered to be a communist state to this day. Cuba had this close relationship with the Soviet Union. That's why I have this picture, which represents communism, and to me it represents the Soviet Union as well. But since the Soviet Union has dissolved as a country, Cuba became a little bit more loose with their policies. The economy has opened up since the 1990s. For example, before, the government did not allow people to run their own private businesses. Castro nationalized every business and industry in Cuba. But since the 1990s, or since the USS dissolved as a country, Castro allowed its people to run their own businesses, and that continues to this day. About 475,000 people today living in Cuba have their own businesses, and they run their own businesses. Even though the economy has opened up, Cuba still lives in poverty. That's why if you go to Cuba today, the setting of Cuba looks like a poor town in the US during the 1950s. Time to move on. US intervention. The US didn't really have a good relationship with Cuba during the Cold War. First of all, the US and Cuba had better relationships with Castro when he took over Cuba. And since Cuba and the USSR, the Soviet Union, were having these talks about, selling sugar to each other, the U.S. did not like the idea of Cuba, negotiating with the USSR, because the Soviet Union was considered to be a communist, or was considered to be a communist state, and if the Soviet Union, influenced Cuba, then Cuba would be a communist state. And remember when I said earlier that the U.S. or the Florida Keys were about 90 miles away from Cuba? Yeah, the U.S. did not want a communist country 90 miles away from its borders. So what President Eisenhower did during the 50s was to put an economic embargo banning U.S. companies from selling anything to Cuba except for food and medicine. Once Kennedy became president in 1961, he and the CIA decided to take Fidel Castro out. So the CIA and President Kennedy the CIA, not Kennedy, the CIA trained Cuban exiles in Guatemala, and they gave them weapons and guns to invade Cuba and take out Castro. This invasion was known as the Bay of Pigs. Eventually, once the invasion started, Castro heard of it, and he sent an airstrike to take down the invasion. and the invasion was put down 3 days later. This was a huge defeat for the Kennedy administration and the CIA, and many Americans criticized them. U.S. American citizens criticized Kennedy and the CIA for this invasion. Right after the invasion, Cuba declared itself as a communist state. So the U.S. lost another country to communism. By another country, I mean that if you go back, let's see, about 15 years ago, in the 1940s, the U.S. lost China to communism because of the Chinese Civil War, and then during the Korean War, the U.S. lost Korea, part of Korea. So now they're 0 for 3, and communism is spreading through the world. But luckily, since the end of the Soviet Union, not many countries are considered to be a communist state. So let's move on. Migration, or as I put it in the title, Immigration and Emigration. Before the Cuban Revolution, many Cubans left Cuba and go to the U.S. because of political problems that were happening in the country. Once Castro took over Cuba, he nationalized every industry, company, like I said earlier. The Cubans who were against Castro's plan fled the country, and most of these Cubans were the elitists, such as the executives and owners of firms, people who ran their own private businesses. In 1965, Castro allowed people who had immigrants or who had residence in the U.S. to leave Cuba. So those people weren't as high class as those people who left during the revolution. They were lower working class citizens. And then in 1989, if we fast forward to 1989, to like the early 2000s, Castro let more people to leave Cuba and go to the U.S. And during the 1990s, Castro allowed its people to go to the U.S. or leave Cuba on rafts, as you can see in the pictures. Before Castro made that rule, or law, or whatever you want to call it, people who left Cuba on a raft, and if they were like spotted by the Cuban government, they would be punished severely. But since Cuba made that rule in the 1990s, people were allowed to leave on rafts. The U.S. opposed that rule, however, and if they caught Cuban exiles, the U.S. would punish them. And now if we fast forward to 2015, as most American citizens or U.S. citizens would know that the relationship between the U.S. and Cuba has improved. And so has immigration, Cuba immigrants coming to the U.S. Over 43,000 Cubans have immigrated to the U.S. by ports of entry during the 2015 fiscal years. This is way more than the year of 2014 when 25,000 immigrants came to Cuba. And most of the Cubans who left Cuba today reside in Miami, which is a popular place where Cubans reside. So that is it for this part. In the next part, I will answer that one question that I always asked myself when I was younger.